Chapter 1. The Weight of Invisibility. The copper scent of dried blood and the acidic sting of lemon floor wax always signaled the start of Nyra's shift in the great hall of the Ironclaw Pack. Because she was born with a dormant wolf that refused to howl, the Omegas treated her like a ghost, while the warriors viewed her as a convenient footstool. Her fingers ached from scrubbing the heavy oak trestles where the dominant males would soon feast. Every rhythmic swipe of her rag served as a countdown to the moment the doors would swing open, admitting the monsters who called themselves her kin. She kept her head low, her dark hair acting as a curtain to hide the bruise blooming across her cheekbone from a run-in with a beta's elbow earlier that morning. Why did the stars grant life to someone intended only to be crushed under the boots of others? Heavy thuds echoed against the stone floor as the Ironclaw warriors filed in, their boisterous laughter sounding like the jagged grinding of tectonic plates. Cassian, the pack's future alpha, led the procession with a predatory swagger that made the air feel thin. He stopped abruptly at the table Nyra was polishing, his shadow swallowing her small frame completely. A smirk pulled at his lips, revealing teeth that looked far too sharp for a man who claimed to be civilized. "Still cleaning the dirt, little mouse? It's a shame you can't scrub away your own pathetic scent," he barked, causing a ripple of cruel chuckles to erupt from his sycophants. Nyra didn't flinch, knowing that any reaction only fed his hunger for dominance. She reached for a pitcher of ale, her movements practiced and mechanical despite the trembling deep within her marrow. As she poured the amber liquid, Cassian leaned in close enough for her to smell the raw meat on his breath. "Look at you, unclaimed, unloved, and utterly useless to the bloodline. No one would ever choose you, Nyra. Not in this life. Not in the next," he hissed into her ear. The words felt like physical barbs, hooking into her self-worth and dragging it through the mud. She wondered if he was right, if she was merely a glitch in the grand design of the Great Spirit. Was there a secret reason her wolf remained silent, or was she simply hollow at the core? Suddenly, the massive iron-bound doors of the fortress groaned on their hinges, cutting through the mockery like a silver blade. A herald's horn blasted a low, vibrating note that rattled the very foundation of the mountain. The atmosphere shifted instantly from rowdy chaos to a suffocating, reverent silence. Even Cassian straightened his posture, his arrogance replaced by a frantic, visible prickle of fear. The Alpha King had arrived, a sovereign whose name was whispered to frighten disobedient pups into submission. Nyra felt a strange, electric hum begin to thrum under her skin, a sensation she had never experienced in her 19 years of existence. It felt like a dormant volcano waking up deep beneath a frozen tundra. A procession of black-clad guards entered first, their armor absorbing the torchlight rather than reflecting it. Then came Kael Draven, the Alpha King of the Midnight Throne. He didn't just walk, he reclaimed the space with every predatory stride. His presence was a physical weight, a gravitational pull that demanded every knee in the room hit the floor. Nyra knelt with the others, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Because she was positioned at the end of the royal table, she was forced to look up just as he passed. For a heartbeat, the world stopped spinning. His eyes, a haunting shade of molten obsidian, locked onto hers. In that gaze, she saw 1,000 storms and a hunger that mirrored her own loneliness. Chapter 2. The Hunter's Gaze. Kael Draven did not move for a long, agonizing minute, his tall frame looming over Nyra like a mountain of dark velvet and jagged stone. The silence in the great hall became a living thing, stretching until it threatened to snap the nerves of everyone present. He could smell the fear in the room, the familiar scent of wood smoke and terror that usually followed him, but beneath it all was something else. A fragrance of crushed violets and ancient lightning drifted from the small girl kneeling at his feet. It was a scent that shouldn't exist in a pack as weak and diluted as the Ironclaw. His wolf rumbled a low, possessive sound deep in his chest that felt like a localized earthquake. "You," Kael said, his voice a rich baritone that vibrated through the floorboards and into Nyra's very bones. He didn't offer a hand, but the intensity of his focus acted like a physical grip. forcing her to remain upright even as her knees wobbled. Nyra felt her pulse racing in her throat, a frantic rhythm that signaled her body's desire to flee. Yet, she found herself unable to look away from the raw power etched into his features. He was a king built for war, his jawline sharp enough to cut glass and his shoulders broad enough to carry the weight of a dying empire. Why was the most powerful male in the world staring at a servant who had been told she was invisible? The Ironclaw Alpha scrambled forward, his forehead nearly touching the ground as he tried to redirect the king's attention. "Sire, please excuse the girl. She is a defect, an omega of no standing who hasn't even mastered the basic etiquette of the court," he stammered, his voice thin and reeking of desperation. Kael's eyes didn't leave Nyra, but a flash of lethal irritation crossed his face. He despised the way these lesser packs treated their own, seeing them as cattle rather than kin. He reached out, his gloved hand hovering just inches from Nyra's chin, and the air between them crackled with an invisible, static charge. Nyra felt a sudden, violent surge of heat erupting from her solar plexus, spreading through her veins like liquid fire. It was the first time she had felt truly alive, as if the gray veil she had lived behind for years was finally being shredded. She saw the king's nostrils flare, his pupils expanding until his eyes were nothing but twin voids of darkness. He looked shaken, a brief flicker of vulnerability crossing his stony mask, before he vanished it behind a wall of regal indifference. Without a word, he turned on his heel and strode toward the high dais, leaving a trail of frigid air in his wake. The tension broke, but the afterimage of his stare remained burned into Nyra's mind. Dinner was a blur of clattering silver and hushed whispers that felt like stinging insects against Nyra's ears. She moved through the shadows of the hall, her hands shaking as she replaced emptied wine chalices. Because she was hyper-aware of the king's presence at the head of the table, she kept her distance, yet she felt his eyes tracking her every movement. It was a game of predator and prey, but she couldn't tell who was playing which role. As the night deepened, the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to grow longer and more sentient. She didn't notice the dark figures sliding through the rafters, their blades coated in a poison that smelled faintly of bitter almonds. Chapter 3: Blood and Betrayal. The first scream shattered the artificial peace of the banquet like a rock through a stained glass window. Nyra had been reaching for a discarded tray when the shadows above the king's table detached themselves and plummeted downward. Assassins clad in silver mesh armor that dampened the sound of their movements swarmed the royal guards with terrifying efficiency. The air was suddenly thick with the metallic tang of fresh blood and the guttural roars of shifting wolves. Nyra froze, her instinct for invisibility clashing with a sudden, irrational need to ensure the king was still breathing. Why did her heart ache at the thought of a man she had only just met falling to a blade? Kael Draven was a whirlwind of lethal grace, his claws extending as he tore through the attackers with a ferocity that defied logic. He didn't need a weapon, he was the weapon. However, the assassins were not targeting him alone. They were creating a distraction. One of the cloaked figures lunged toward the servant's entrance, aiming to cut off the escape route, and collided directly with Nyra. She was thrown backward, her head striking the stone pillar with a sickening thud. Stars exploded in her vision, but through the haze, she saw the assassin raising a jagged dagger. She was a liability, a witness to a failure in security that the pack would never allow to survive. "Kill her! She's seen too much!" a voice shouted from the chaos, and Nyra realized with a jolt of horror that it was the Ironclaw Alpha giving the order. In the heat of the battle, he was using the assassination attempt to purge the weakness from his pack. Nyra closed her eyes, waiting for the cold bite of steel, accepting that her end would be as unremarkable as her beginning. She had lived a life where no one chose her, so it only made sense that she would die alone in a corner of a burning hall. But the strike never came. Instead, a sound like a thunderclap echoed through the room, followed by the wet crunch of breaking bone. She opened her eyes to see Kael Draven standing over her, his hand wrapped around the assassin's throat, lifting the man off the ground as if he weighed nothing. The king's cape was tattered, and blood, both his and his enemies, slicked his powerful chest. He looked down at her, his expression a terrifying mix of protective rage and possessive hunger. The Ironclaw warriors halted their fighting, staring in shock as their sovereign defended a lowly servant. Kael tossed the lifeless body of the assassin aside and turned his gaze to the Ironclaw Alpha, who was trembling so hard his teeth were chattering. "You would execute what belongs to me." Kael's voice was a low growl that caused the torches to flicker and die. He stepped toward Nyra, reaching down to pull her from the floor with a strength that felt both terrifying and strangely grounding. He didn't just help her up, he hauled her against his chest, tucking her head under his chin in a gesture of absolute claim. The heat from his body was intoxicating, a furnace that promised to burn away her past. "Listen well, traitors and cowards," he roared, his voice carrying to every corner of the blood-stained hall. "She is mine. From this moment until the stars fall, she is the queen of the Midnight Throne." Nyra gasped, her fingers clutching the expensive fabric of his tunic as the world tilted on its axis. She was an unwanted Omega, a girl whose own father had looked past her, yet here was the Alpha King declaring her his in front of the world. Humiliation fought with a budding sense of power deep in her chest. Was this a trick of the light? Or had the monster truly chosen the mouse? As the guards moved to surround them, she realized her life of invisibility was over. She was no longer a ghost in the halls. She was a target on a throne. The journey to the capital would begin at dawn, and with it, the uncovering of secrets that had been buried in blood for generations. Chapter 4: The Price of Royal Blood. The iron-rimmed wheels of the royal carriage groaned against the jagged mountain pass, a sound that mimicked the grinding anxiety in Nyra's chest. Because the transition from a cellar-dwelling servant to a king's declared mate happened in a heartbeat, her mind struggled to stitch the two realities together. She sat draped in heavy furs that smelled of cedar and masculine musk, yet she felt more naked than she ever had in her rags. Across from her, Kael Draven sat in a silence so profound it felt like a physical weight pressing against the velvet upholstery. He hadn't spoken since they crossed the Ironclaw border, his gaze fixed on the passing blur of skeletal pines. Was he regretting the impulsive claim he made in the heat of a bloodbath? Nyra shifted, the silk of her new tunic itching against skin that was used to course burlap. "Why did you do it?" she whispered, the question escaping before her fear could catch it. The carriage hit a deep rut, tossing her toward him, but he caught her forearms with lightning speed, his grip firm yet strangely careful. The heat from his palms seared through her sleeves, igniting a trail of goosebumps that had nothing to do with the mountain chill. He didn't let go immediately, his thumbs brushing against the delicate pulse point of her wrists. Why was the king of the Midnight Throne touching a defect with such reverent intensity? Kael's eyes finally drifted to hers, the molten obsidian swirling with a storm of unspoken warnings. "Because the alternative was watching your throat meet a blade, and my wolf would have razed that entire fortress to the ground to prevent it," he answered, his voice a low vibration that skipped down her spine. He released her abruptly, as if the contact burned him just as much as it did her. "Do not mistake salvation for a fairy tale, Nyra. You are now the most hated woman in the 7 territories because you represent a disruption of a 1,000-year-old hierarchy." He leaned back, his silhouette cutting a jagged line against the dim carriage light. The realization hit her like a physical blow, cold and sobering. She wasn't a princess being rescued. She was a political landmine that had just been moved to a more volatile location. Every alpha in the kingdom expected their daughters to fill the seat beside him, and she was the glitch that ruined their ambitions. As they climbed higher toward the capital of Nocturnia, the air grew thinner, smelling of old stone and ozone. She looked out the window, seeing the flickering torches of the royal vanguard, a literal wall of steel meant to keep the world out. Or was it meant to keep her in? A sudden, sharp pain flared behind her eyes, accompanied by a phantom scent of burning sage. For a second, the carriage disappeared, replaced by a vision of a white wolf running through a forest of silver trees. The image was so vivid she could feel the snow beneath her paws. a sensation of freedom she had never known in her human form. Then, as quickly as it came, it vanished, leaving her gasping for air. Kael was watching her now, his brow furrowed in a way that suggested he had felt the shift in her energy. "Your scent is changing," he remarked, his voice dropping to a predatory whisper that made her heart gallop. Chapter 5. The City of Shadows. The capital of Nocturnia rose out of the mist like a crown of obsidian thorns, its spires piercing the low-hanging clouds. Because the city was built into the side of a dormant volcano, the very ground radiated a faint rhythmic heat that felt like a heartbeat beneath Nyra's boots. As the carriage rolled through the massive gates, she saw thousands of citizens lined up in the rain, their eyes wide with a mixture of awe and simmering resentment. She was the Omega Queen, a whisper that traveled faster than the horses, a scandal wrapped in silk. She kept her chin parallel to the floor, mimicking the stoicism she had observed in Kael, though her insides felt like frayed wire. The great citadel was a labyrinth of echoing marble and tapestries that depicted the bloody history of the Lycan lineage. Kael led her through the gauntlet of courtiers, his hand resting firmly on the small of her back, a silent command for the vultures to keep their distance. "Stay close and do not speak unless I address you first," he muttered, his breath warm against her ear. "The nobility here use words like daggers, and they are looking for any crack in your armor." Nyra nodded, her senses overwhelmed by the sheer opulence and the clashing scents of 100 different high-ranking wolves. It was a sea of predators, and she was the only one without teeth. They were met in the throne room by the High Council, a group of ancient alphas whose silver hair and scarred faces spoke of a century of ruthlessness. The leader, a man named Valerius, stepped forward with a smile that didn't reach his predatory eyes. "A bold move, sire, to bring a stray into the heart of the kingdom. Is she a pet, or do you truly intend to crown a girl who cannot even shift?" The question was a challenge, a spark thrown into a powder keg. Nyra felt the collective gaze of the council boring into her, searching for the weakness everyone claimed she possessed. Kael's posture didn't change, but the air in the room suddenly dropped by 10 degrees. "She is the future of this throne because I have willed it so, Valerius. If any of you find my judgment lacking, the dueling pits are open at dawn." The silence that followed was absolute, a testament to the king's undisputed lethality. He turned to Nyra, his eyes softening for a fraction of a second, a detail she was sure no one else noticed. "The master of the household will show you to your chambers. We will begin your instruction tomorrow." He dismissed her with a curt nod, but the way his gaze lingered on her retreating figure suggested a deeper conflict. Once inside her room, Nyra collapsed against the heavy mahogany door, her lungs finally expanding. The chamber was larger than the entire servants' quarters of the Ironclaw Pack, filled with gold-leafed furniture and windows that overlooked the glowing lava flows of the valley. She walked to the vanity and stared at her reflection, hardly recognizing the girl in the mirror. Her eyes seemed brighter, the amber flecks swirling with a strange new intensity. She reached for a crystal carafe of water, but as her fingers brushed the glass, it shattered into 1,000 jagged diamonds. She hadn't even squeezed it. Why was her body reacting to a power she wasn't supposed to have? Chapter 6. The Awakening Tremor. The first day of her new life began not with a crown, but with the grueling reality of a warrior's training. Kael insisted on supervising her personally, leading her to a private courtyard hidden behind the ancient walls of the inner sanctum. Because he didn't trust the court instructors with her safety, he stripped off his heavy royal robe, revealing a sleeveless tunic that showcased the corded muscles of his arms. Nyra stood opposite him, feeling small and utterly out of her element in the leather training gear they had provided. "You spent your life being invisible to survive," Kael said, circling her like a wolf evaluating its prey. "In this city, invisibility will get you killed. You must learn to occupy space." He lunged without warning, not with full strength, but with enough speed to make Nyra yelp as she dove to the side. "Reaction is survival. Proaction is victory, he coached, his voice stern and devoid of the tenderness she had glimpsed the night before. For hours, he pushed her, forcing her to move until her lungs burned and her sweat soaked through the leather. Every time she fell, he stood over her, his eyes demanding she get back up. He wasn't being cruel. He was being necessary. He knew better than anyone that the wolves of Nocturnia would tear her apart the moment he turned his back. During a brief rest, Kael handed her a water skin, his fingers lingering against hers as their eyes met. The tension between them was no longer just political. It was primal, a magnetic pull that made the very air vibrate. "Why are you doing this yourself?" she asked, her voice raspy from exertion. "You have an army of trainers." Kael stepped closer, invading her personal space until she was backed against a stone pillar. "Because no one else is allowed to see you like this," he whispered, his gaze dropping to her lips. "And because I need to know if the fire I see in your eyes is real or just a reflection of my own." The moment was shattered by the sound of approaching footsteps. A messenger scurried into the courtyard, his face pale and his hands trembling as he offered a sealed scroll. Kael ripped it open, his expression darkening with every line he read. "The border packs are restless. They claim I have insulted the Great Spirit by choosing an Omega." He crumpled the parchment, his knuckles turning white. "They are calling for a trial of blood." Nyra felt the world tilt again. She was the cause of a civil war, a girl who couldn't even growl, leading a kingdom into a massacre. That night, Nyra couldn't sleep, her mind a frantic loop of Kael's face and the council's threats. She began to pace the room, her movements becoming more fluid, more predatory, without her even realizing it. A strange heat began to radiate from her palms again, and she felt a pressure behind her ribs that felt like a door being kicked from the inside. She walked to the window, looking out at the moon, and for the first time in her life, she didn't feel like a mistake. She felt like a storm waiting to happen. Why did the stars choose her for this path, and what would happen to Kael when she finally broke the seal on her soul? Chapter 7. The Silk and the Snare. The heavy velvet curtains of the royal dressing room felt like the walls of a plush golden cage as Nyra stood motionless for the seamstresses. Because the High Council demanded a formal presentation of the king's chosen mate, she was being stitched into a gown of midnight silk that shimmered like oil on water. The fabric clung to her curves in a way that made her feel exposed, a stark contrast to the oversized tunics she had used as shields in the Ironclaw Pack. Every silver pin that pricked her skin reminded her that she was a doll being dressed for a massacre. Why did the nobility insist on beautifying a woman they intended to destroy before the final course was served? Kael entered the chambers with a heavy stride that sent the servants scurrying into the shadows like frightened mice. He stopped behind her, his reflection in the tall triptych mirror overlapping with hers, until they looked like a single dark entity. His hands, calloused and warm, settled on her bare shoulders, his touch sending a jolt of static electricity through her spine that made her breath hitch. "You look like a queen who has already conquered the world she stands upon," he murmured, his voice a low vibration that resonated in her chest. He didn't look like a man preparing for a political banquet. He looked like a wolf guarding his most precious kill. Nyra turned in his hold, her fingers grazing the intricate embroidery of his formal doublet. "They don't want a queen, Kael. They want a target," she whispered, her eyes searching his for a truth he hadn't yet voiced. The pressure in her chest, that strange internal door that had been rattling since their training, felt heavier tonight, as if the sheer density of the court's hatred was pushing against it. She could smell the scent of lavender and old parchment on him, but beneath it was the metallic tang of his wolf, restless and ready to strike. Why was he risking his crown for a girl who hadn't even shown her claws? Kael leaned down, his forehead resting against hers in a rare moment of public vulnerability that made the air in the room feel thick and sweet. "Let them aim their arrows at you, Nyra. I will be the shield that breaks every single one of them," he promised, his breath fanning across her lips. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a necklace of raw black diamonds, the stones jagged and unpolished. As he fastened it around her neck, the cold weight of the gems felt like a brand. He wasn't just dressing her. He was marking her in the only way the human eye could perceive. The walk to the banquet hall was a gauntlet of whispered insults and predatory stares that Nyra navigated with a borrowed strength. Because she held Kael's arm, she felt the rhythmic tension of his muscles, a constant reminder that she was protected by the most dangerous apex in the room. As the massive doors swung open, the sea of nobles parted, their faces masks of strained politeness. She saw the way the younger females looked at her, with a jealousy so sharp it was almost a scent. She realized then that in this world, love was not a gift. It was a resource to be hoarded, fought over, and stolen. Chapter 8. The Dance of Teeth. The banquet table was a landscape of roasted meats and blood-red wine, yet Nyra found she couldn't swallow a single bite. Because she sat at Kael's right hand, she was the focal point of every conversation, a specimen under a microscope. Valerius, the head of the High Council, sat across from them, his eyes tracking Nyra's every flinch with a sickening amount of glee. "Tell us, Lady Nyra, how does an Omega find the courage to sit amongst alphas? Is it true your own pack considered you a ghost?" he asked, his voice dripping with a false concern that didn't hide the venom beneath. The table went silent, the clatter of silver stopping as everyone waited for her to crumble. Nyra felt the familiar sting of shame rising in her throat, the ghost of Cassian's laughter echoing in her mind. But then she felt Kael's hand slide under the table, his fingers interlacing with hers, squeezing with a strength that grounded her. She took a slow breath, noticing for the first time that the wine in Valerius's glass was vibrating, tiny ripples forming on the surface as if a small earthquake were happening right under his chair. Was she doing that? She straightened her back, her gaze meeting the old alphas with a coldness that surprised even her. "Being a ghost taught me how to watch, Valerius. I've seen more in the shadows than you've ever noticed in the light," she replied, her voice steady and sharp. A ripple of uneasy murmurs broke out, but Kael's dark chuckle cut through the tension like a saw. "Careful, Valerius. My mate has a bite you haven't felt yet," he warned, his eyes flashing a warning yellow. The meal continued, but the atmosphere had shifted from mockery to a wary observation. After the feast, the floor was cleared for the traditional sparring dance, a display of dominance meant to showcase the strength of the ruling couples. Kael led Nyra to the center of the floor, his hand firm on her waist. "Follow my lead. Trust your body more than your mind," he whispered, his eyes locked on hers. The music was a primal beat of drums and low strings, a rhythm that seemed to synchronize with the thumping in Nyra's blood. They moved together, a blur of midnight silk and black leather, their bodies clashing and intertwining in a choreographed battle. For the first time, Nyra didn't feel like a klutz, she felt like a flame. As Kael spun her, she felt a sudden, violent surge of power erupt from her core, a heat so intense it felt like her skin was glowing. For a split second, her vision shifted to infrared, seeing the heat signatures of every wolf in the room. Why was her dormant wolf suddenly howling in the back of her mind? The dance ended with Kael dipping her low, his face inches from hers as the court erupted into a forced applause. But the moment was ruined by a sudden, choking sound from the edge of the floor. A young guard collapsed, his face turning a bruised shade of purple as he clawed at his throat. "Poison!" someone screamed, and the hall descended into a chaotic frenzy of bared teeth and shifting forms. Kael pulled Nyra behind him, his claws extending as he scanned the room for the assassin. The hunt had moved from the shadows of the Ironclaw Pack to the very heart of the royal palace. Chapter 9. The Shadow of the Lycan. The air in the banquet hall became a toxic soup of panic and the musky scent of terrified shifters. Kael stood over the fallen guard, his nostrils flaring as he inhaled the scent of the dying man's breath. "Wolfsbane and hemlock," he growled, his voice dropping an octave as his inner beast pushed to the surface. He turned his gaze to the wine carafe Nyra had almost touched earlier, his eyes turning a lethal, glowing obsidian. Someone had intended for the Omega Queen to die tonight, and the realization sent a wave of such intense protective fury through him that the windows of the hall rattled in their frames. Why was the enemy so desperate to eliminate a girl they claimed was powerless? Nyra felt a strange, humming vibration in her fingertips, the same energy that had shattered the glass in her room. She walked toward the center of the hall, her movements fluid and trance-like, ignoring Kael's command to stay back. She knelt beside the dying guard, her hands hovering over his chest. "He's not just poisoned. His spirit is being suppressed," she whispered, her voice sounding like two people speaking at once. She didn't know how she knew this, but she could see the dark, oily strands of magic wrapping around the man's heart. Because she was a defect, she had always been told she had no connection to the spiritual world, yet here she was, seeing the invisible. As her palms touched the guard's skin, a blinding flash of white light erupted from her body, throwing the nearby nobles back against the walls. The guard gasped, his lungs filling with air as the purple tint vanished from his skin. The dark magic dissipated like smoke in a gale, leaving Nyra gasping and trembling on the floor. The silence that followed was different than before. It was a silence of pure, unadulterated terror. High Alpha Valerius stepped forward, his face pale as he pointed a shaking finger at her. "That is not the power of an Omega. That is the light of the lost bloodline," he hissed, his voice trembling with a century of buried fear. Kael was at her side in an instant, shielding her from the accusing stares of the council. "What did you see, Valerius?" he demanded, his hand gripping the hilt of his ceremonial sword. The old man wouldn't meet his eyes, his gaze fixed on Nyra as if she were a ghost come to life. "The lichen blood," Valerius whispered, the words sending a shockwave through the room. "The line your father was ordered to extinguish. The healers who could break any curse and lead any pack." Nyra felt the floor drop out from under her. Her family hadn't been weak. They had been a threat to the very hierarchy Kael now sat upon. Kael's grip on her arm tightened, but it wasn't a gesture of comfort anymore. It was a desperate hold on a reality that was shattering. "My father told me they were all gone. He told me the world was safer without them," he said, his voice thick with a sudden agonizing betrayal. He looked down at Nyra, seeing her not as a servant he had saved, but as the daughter of the people his own bloodline had slaughtered. The romance that had begun to bloom in the training circle was suddenly choked by the weeds of a forgotten genocide. How could they ever be together when his crown was forged from the bones of her ancestors? Chapter 10. The Archive of Bones. The air in the royal library tasted of dust and forgotten sins, a heavy atmosphere that seemed to press against Nyra's lungs as she moved through the towering shelves. Because the revelation at the banquet had branded her a living ghost, the servants now fled from her path, crossing their fingers to ward off the lichen curse. She ignored the stinging silence of the hallways, her focus entirely on the leather-bound ledgers that Kael's father had hidden behind a false wall of military records. Her fingers brushed against a spine bound in silver thread wolfskin, and a jolt of recognition sparked in her marrow. Why did a book she had never seen before feel like a part of her own body? Kael was somewhere in the war room, screaming at his generals about the brewing rebellion, but Nyra knew the real war was here, buried in the ink. She pulled the silver book from the shelf, and it fell open to a page dated 20 years ago, the year of her birth. The handwriting was jagged, frantic, detailing the cleansing of the silver glade and the systematic execution of every shifter whose eyes held the amber fleck of the lichen healers. Because her mother had been a servant who fled into the Ironclaw territory, Nyra had been raised in a cellar, her true nature suppressed by the very people who claimed to be her protectors. She wasn't an Omega because of a biological fluke. She was an Omega because she had been magically lobotomized. A shadow fell across the page, and she didn't need to turn to know the scent of rain and scorched earth. Kael stood in the doorway, his regal posture sagging with the weight of a heritage he never asked for. "My father's journals," he stated, his voice a hollow echo of the man who had claimed her in the Great Hall. He walked toward her, his boots thudding like a funeral drum on the marble floor. "He didn't just kill them, Nyra. He erased them from the songs, from the laws, and from the memory of the packs because he feared their power to heal would make his power to destroy obsolete. Nyra turned to face him, the book clutched to her chest like a shield. "And now you sit on his throne, wearing the crown he bought with my family's blood," she whispered, her voice trembling with a cocktail of grief and budding fury. The attraction that had sizzled between them now felt like a betrayal, a sick joke played by a fate that enjoyed watching monsters fall in love with their victims. Kael reached out, his hand trembling as he tried to touch her cheek, but she flinched away. Why did the man who saved her life have to be the son of the man who destroyed her soul? The candles in the room flared a brilliant, unnatural blue, responding to the turbulence of her emotions. Nyra felt the internal door in her mind finally splintering, the wood groaning under the pressure of 20 years of repressed magic. She looked at Kael, and for a moment, she didn't see a king. She saw an obstacle. "I spent my whole life wondering why I wasn't enough, why no one would ever choose me," she said, her voice dropping to a dangerous, melodic hum. "But I wasn't the mistake, Kael. This entire kingdom is the mistake." Chapter 11. The Shattered Mirror. The midpoint of the lunar cycle brought a blood moon that turned the lava flows of Nocturnia into rivers of gore. Because the political pressure had reached a breaking point, Kael was forced to convene a public trial in the heart of the volcano, the sacred arena where kings were made or broken. Nyra stood in the center of the obsidian circle, surrounded by thousands of snarling wolves who wanted her head on a pike. She felt the gaze of the Ironclaw Alpha in the crowd, his face pale with the realization that the mouse he had kicked for years was actually a lioness in disguise. Why did it take the threat of death to make her feel the full extent of her own life? Kael stood on the high balcony, his face a mask of frozen stone as he addressed the assembly. "The girl is not a defect. She is the last of the Silver Glade, and by the laws of the first ancestors, she is the only one fit to stand beside the Midnight Throne," he roared, but his words were met with a chorus of mocking howls. Valerius stepped forward, holding a silver bowl filled with liquid wolfsbane. "If she is a lichen, let the poison prove it. If she survives the draft, we kneel. If she dies, the king must take a new mate from the pure bloodlines." Nyra looked up at Kael, seeing the desperation in his eyes, the silent plea for her to run, to flee into the tunnels and never look back. But she was done running. Because she had spent 19 years in the dark, the light of the moon felt like a homecoming. She stepped toward the silver bowl, her hand steady as she took it from Valerius. "You think you can poison a well that has already been poisoned by your lies?" she asked, her voice carrying to the furthest reaches of the arena. She drank the liquid in one go, the bitter taste of death sliding down her throat like honey. For a heartbeat, the world went silent. Then, the agony hit. It wasn't the pain of dying. It was the pain of a chrysalis breaking. Nyra's bones began to snap and reform, her skin stretching as a white fur, brighter than the stars, erupted from her pores. A howl ripped from her throat, not the high-pitched yip of an omega, but a deep, resonant boom that vibrated in the chests of every wolf present. The air in the arena began to swirl into a localized hurricane, the sheer force of her transformation throwing the council members off their feet. She was no longer Nyra the servant. She was the silver wolf of the glade. Kael leaped from the balcony, shifting mid-air into a massive black wolf that looked like a shadow carved from the night. He landed beside her, his molten eyes wide with a mixture of terror and worship. The two of them stood in the center of the arena, the Black King and the White Queen, a sight that hadn't been seen in 3 centuries. But the rebellion wasn't silenced. It was ignited. The Alpha hierarchy saw their end in her eyes, and they weren't going to go quietly into the night. As the first of the rebel wolves lunged into the circle, Nyra realized that love wouldn't be enough to save them. They would have to bleed for it. Chapter 12. The Dawn of Rebellion. The immediate aftermath of the transformation was a blur of teeth and silver-tipped spears. Because Nyra had awakened a power that could neutralize the Alpha's command, the soldiers of the High Council found themselves unable to shift, their wolves cowed by the presence of a true Lycan. She moved through the battlefield like a ghost made of starlight, her claws leaving trails of white fire in the air. She didn't kill. She disabled, her touch sending a wave of calming magic that put the maddened wolves to sleep. Why was she showing mercy to a people who had cheered for her execution only moments ago? Kael fought at her back, his black fur matted with the blood of those who dared to challenge his claim. He was a force of nature, a hurricane of muscle and fang that kept the circle clear around her. But even as they fought together, there was a distance between them that no physical closeness could bridge. Every time he looked at her, he saw the sins of his father, and every time she looked at him, she saw the throne that demanded her silence. The bond was there, thrumming like a live wire between their souls, but it was being strained by the weight of 1,000 secrets. By the time the sun began to peek over the volcanic rim, the arena was littered with the unconscious bodies of the Council's elite guards. Valerius had vanished into the shadows of the city, likely to regroup with the border packs who were already marching on the capital. Kael shifted back into his human form, his naked body scarred and beautiful in the early morning light. He approached Nyra, who stood amidst the rubble, her white fur stained with soot and sweat. As she shifted back, she felt a sudden, crushing exhaustion, her knees giving out before she could find her balance. He caught her, pulling her into a tight embrace that smelled of ozone and victory. "You did it," he whispered into her hair, his voice thick with an emotion she couldn't quite name. "You showed them what they feared most." Nyra pushed against his chest, her eyes searching his. "I didn't do it for them, Kael. And I didn't do it for you. I did it because I was tired of being small." She saw the flash of hurt in his eyes, the realization that the girl he had claimed was now a woman he could no longer control. The horn of the Northern Scouts blasted a warning note from the city walls. The rebellion wasn't over. It was just beginning. Thousands of wolves from the outer territories were descending on Nocturnia, led by the very men who had helped Kael's father wipe out the Lycans. They weren't coming for the throne. They were coming to finish the job. Nyra looked at the horizon, her heart hardening into a diamond. She was the last of her kind, the girl no one chose, and she was about to show the world that a healer could be just as deadly as a king. How many lives would it cost to fix a broken world, and would hers be one of them? Chapter 13. The General of Ghosts. The war room was a tomb of flickering candlelight and the heavy scent of old blood that wouldn't wash off the map table. Because the rebellion had swelled to include 4 of the 7 border packs, Kael's generals sat in a tense circle of bared teeth and low, rumbling growls. Nyra stood at the head of the table, her presence no longer an afterthought but a central, terrifying sun around which they all orbited. She wore a suit of boiled leather and silver mail that caught the orange glow of the hearth, her white hair braided back like a coronet of frost. Why did these men, who once mocked her for being a defect, now look at her with a fear that bordered on worship? Kael paced behind her, his hand never leaving the hilt of his blade, his eyes tracking every movement of the Alpha Lords who remained loyal to the crown. "The rebels are digging into the Iron Pass. They know we can't take the valley without exposing the capital to a flanking maneuver from the south," he stated, his voice a gravelly rasp from lack of sleep. He pointed to the map, but his gaze kept sliding back to Nyra, searching for the girl he had rescued in the Ironclaw kitchen. He found a stranger instead, a woman whose amber eyes held the weight of 1,000 years of ancestral memory. Because he had claimed her, he felt her power humming against his own like a vibrating chord, a constant reminder that she was the true apex in the room. Nyra leaned over the table, her fingers tracing the mountain range where her family had once thrived before the Great Cleansing. "They aren't digging in to hide, Kael. They are waiting for the lunar eclipse," she whispered, her voice carrying a melodic resonance that caused the candles to flare in unison. She could feel the pulse of the earth through the soles of her boots, a rhythmic thrumming that told her the border alphas were performing a dark ritual to seal the Lycan light. Why was she the only one who could hear the mountains screaming for justice? The council erupted in a cacophony of disagreement, their voices clashing like rusted iron. She's a healer, not a tactician. We should send the vanguard now while we have the height advantage, one lord barked, his eyes flashing a rebellious yellow. Nyra didn't raise her voice, but she allowed a sliver of her power to leak out, a wave of silver pressure that forced the alphas to go quiet and lower their heads. I am the blood of the Silver Glade. I don't need a map to see your enemies, and I don't need a sword to break them, she said, her words chilling the air. Kael stepped into her space, his warmth a sharp contrast to the cold magic radiating from her skin. Nyra, you're pushing too hard. Your wolf hasn't fully integrated with your human heart yet, he cautioned, his hand reaching for hers. She didn't pull away this time, but her grip was tight, desperate. If I don't push, we all burn, Kael. Your father started this fire, and I'm the only one who can walk through the flames to put it out. The silence between them was a battlefield of its own, a space where love was being slowly suffocated by the demands of a dying kingdom. Chapter 14. The Tether of Desire. The eve of the march brought a silence to the citadel that was more unnerving than the sounds of clashing steel. Because she knew the morning might bring her end, Nyra sought out the one place where she could still feel human, the private balcony overlooking the lava falls. She stood in the spray of heat and ash, her mind a chaotic loop of ancient spells and modern betrayals. A footstep behind her signaled Kael's arrival, his scent of rain and mountain air cutting through the sulfur. He didn't speak as he wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her back against the solid heat of his chest. Why did his touch still have the power to make her feel like the girl in the kitchen? Kael buried his face in the crook of her neck, his breath hot against her skin. Stay in the rear tomorrow. Let the vanguard take the first wave, he murmured, his voice thick with a vulnerability he only showed her in the dark. He turned her around in his arms, his eyes searched hers with an intensity that made her knees feel weak. I didn't choose you to be a martyr, Nyra. I chose you because I couldn't breathe in a world where you didn't exist. The confession was a jagged blade, cutting through the armor she had built around her heart. She reached up, her fingers tracing the scars on his jawline, the marks of a king who had fought for every inch of his territory. You didn't choose me, Kael. The bond did. The blood did, she countered, her voice trembling with the weight of her own desire. But even as she said it, she knew it was a lie. He had stood between her and an executioner's blade before he knew she was a lichen. He had seen the nothing and called it everything. She pulled him down, her lips meeting his in a kiss that tasted of salt and desperation, a frantic attempt to anchor themselves to the present. The kiss deepened, turning from a comfort into a conflagration that threatened to consume them both. Kael's hands were everywhere, possessive and urgent, as he backed her against the stone railing. Because they were both shifting internally, the friction between them felt like lightning striking a forest. Mark me, she whispered against his mouth, a plea for a permanence that the war couldn't steal. She wanted his scent on her skin, his soul bound to hers so tightly that even death wouldn't know where one ended and the other began. Why was the most dangerous man in the world hesitating to take what was already his? Kael pulled back just an inch, his eyes glowing a fierce, predatory gold. If I mark you now, your power will be tied to my throne forever. You'll never be truly free of my father's legacy. He groaned, the conflict tearing him apart. Nyra grabbed his hair, forcing his gaze back to hers. I don't want to be free of you, Kael. I want to be the reason you survive. The air around them began to hum, a silver and black aura swirling as their wolves recognized the impending union. But before his teeth could find the sensitive skin of her shoulder, a frantic pounding on the chamber door shattered the moment. Chapter 15. The Exposure of Kings. The messenger who burst into the room was covered in a layer of frost, his face a mask of pure terror. Because he had ridden from the northern gate without stopping, his horse had collapsed under him, and his words came out in a ragged wheeze. The High Council, they aren't at the pass. They've breached the city through the old catacombs. The revelation was a physical blow, a masterstroke of betrayal that bypassed all their defenses. Kael was across the room in a heartbeat, his royal robes discarded for his leather armor, his face transforming into the mask of the Alpha King. Nyra followed him into the corridor, her heart hammering against her ribs. How? The catacombs were sealed a century ago, she asked, her mind racing through the history she had read in the archives. Kael stopped at the top of the great staircase, looking down at the flickering torches of an invading army already inside his walls. Only an alpha of the blood knows the sequence to the seals, he said, his voice dropping to a deathly whisper. He turned to look at the portraits of his ancestors lining the hall, realizing that the call was coming from inside the house. Below them, the doors to the great hall burst open, and Valerius stepped out, flanked by the very alphas who had sat at Kael's table only hours before. But it was the man standing beside Valerius that made Nyra's blood turn to ice. It was Cassian, the Ironclaw heir, his face twisted in a sneer of triumph. "You thought you could hide a monster on a throne, Draven," Cassian shouted, his voice echoing through the vaulted ceiling. "The people don't want a lichen healer, they want the strength of the pure bloodlines, and they'll burn this city to the ground to get it." Kael stepped onto the landing, his presence expanding until he seemed to fill the entire staircase. "You brought an enemy army into your own capital to settle a grudge, Cassian? You are no alpha. You are a scavenger," he roared, his voice causing the dust to fall from the rafters. But Valerius stepped forward, holding a scroll that looked centuries old. "The people should know the truth. The king didn't find a mate. He found a weapon to enslave us all. He knew of her lineage before he ever brought her here. It was a plot to resurrect the lichen tyranny." Nyra felt the world tilt as the betrayal shifted from the rebels to the man standing beside her. She looked at Kael, her amber eyes searching for a denial that didn't come quickly enough. "Did you know?" she whispered, the question a tiny thing in the face of the growing riot below. Kael didn't look at her, his focus entirely on the threat in front of them. "I knew there were rumors, Nyra. I didn't care about the politics, I cared about you." But the seed of doubt had been planted, and it was growing with the speed of a poison vine. Why did every truth in this palace come with a layer of deception? Chapter 16. The Collapse of Trust. The air in the grand corridor turned to liquid lead as the echo of Valerius's accusation bounced off the marble ribs of the ceiling. Because the truth was often a weapon more serrated than any blade, Nyra felt the jagged edges of Kael's silence flaying her open from the inside out. She stood frozen while the man she had begun to love kept his gaze fixed on the rebels below, his jaw locked in a grimace of tactical calculation. Had he truly seen a girl in that Ironclaw kitchen, or had he simply spotted a long-lost relic that could solidify his failing grip on the 7 territories? The flickering torchlight cast long, monstrous shadows behind him, making him look less like her savior and more like the jailer she had always feared he was. Kael finally turned, his obsidian eyes fractured with a desperation that looked painfully like guilt. "Nyra, listen to me. The rumors of the Silver Glade were myths until I saw you bleed," he started, his voice a low, frantic rumble that failed to soothe the roaring in her ears. He reached for her hand, but she recoiled as if his skin were coated in silver nitrate, her heart hammering a frantic, broken rhythm against her ribs. Why did the warmth of his touch suddenly feel like the deceptive heat of a predator's breath before the kill? She backed away, her heels clicking against the stone like the ticking of a clock counting down to her own destruction. Below them, the sound of the heavy oak doors splintering under a battering ram signaled the end of diplomacy. "He used you, little wolf!" Cassian's voice rose from the pit of the hall, dripping with a malicious satisfaction that turned Nyra's stomach. He needed a miracle to stop the border wars, and he found one in a servant's rags. Because the Ironclaw heir had spent years perfecting the art of her humiliation, he knew exactly where to twist the knife. Nyra looked at the sea of snarling faces below, and then back at Kael, seeing the weight of the crown pressing down on his brow. Was she ever a woman to him, or just the ultimate political leverage? The internal door in Nyra's mind, the one that held back the tidal wave of her lichen power, suddenly groaned under the weight of her grief. She felt a cold, numbing sensation spreading from her fingertips, a frost that had nothing to do with the winter air outside. "You knew my family was hunted by yours, and you still brought me here to be your shield," she whispered, her voice sounding hollow, like wind howling through a tomb. The betrayal wasn't just in his silence, it was in the way he had let her believe she was finally being chosen for herself. Kael stepped forward, his face a mask of agony, but the distance between them had already become an ocean. Chapter 17. The Sealed Fate. The rebellion surged into the heart of the citadel like a dark tide, the clatter of iron boots drowned out by the primal roars of shifting wolves. Because the palace was built on secrets, the very walls seemed to bleed shadows as the High Council's assassins materialized from the tapestries. Kael was a blur of black fur and rage, throwing himself into the fray to keep the attackers from reaching the landing where Nyra stood. He fought with a suicidal ferocity, his claws tearing through mail and bone. But for every rebel he felled, 3 more climbed over the corpses. Why was he fighting so hard to protect a woman who no longer believed in him? Nyra watched the carnage with a detached horror, her senses overwhelmed by the metallic stench of the slaughter. A hand gripped her shoulder, and she spun around, her claws extending instinctively, only to find the palace's chief healer, Alara, standing there with a face as pale as parchment. "You have to leave, Nyra. They aren't here for the king. They're here for the source of the light." Alara pulled her toward a concealed door behind a statue of the first Alpha. Because Alara had been the one to tend to Nyra's wounds after the training sessions, she was the only person left in the palace Nyra felt she could trust. They descended into the damp, moss-covered tunnels beneath the volcano, the sounds of the battle fading into a dull, rhythmic thumping above. "I did it for the kingdom," Alara whispered suddenly, her voice trembling as she stopped in a circular chamber marked with ancient runes. Nyra turned, a cold dread settling in her gut as she saw the silver ceremonial dagger in the healer's hand. "I was the one who helped the king's father seal your wolf 20 years ago," Alara confessed, her eyes filling with tears of a regret that came too late. The revelation was a physical blow, a final thread snapping in the tapestry of Nyra's reality. The healer lunged, not to kill, but to press a sigil-carved stone against Nyra's forehead, a relic designed to put the lichen spirit back into its cage. "If you stay awake, they will use you to enslave us all. Sleep, child of the glade." Nyra fought back, her silver aura flaring in a desperate attempt to reject the suppression. But because she was emotionally shattered, her magic was brittle, flickering like a candle in a gale. She felt the heavy, suffocating blanket of the seal falling over her mind, dragging her down into a darkness where no howl could reach. Why did everyone she trusted eventually try to turn her into a statue? Chapter 18. The Dark Night of the Soul. The world returned to Nyra in fragments of gray ash and the bitter taste of copper on her tongue. She was lying on the cold stone of the catacombs, the silence so absolute it felt like she had gone deaf. Because the seal had partially succeeded, she could no longer feel the hum of the earth or the comforting heat of the volcano's heart. She was back to being the nothing she had been in the Ironclaw cellar, a girl without a wolf, a queen without a crown. She crawled toward the narrow slit of a ventilation shaft, looking out over the city of Nocturnia as it burned under the indifferent gaze of the moon. The royal banner had been torn down from the central spire, replaced by the jagged sigil of the High Council. Kael was gone, his scent scrubbed from the air by the acrid smoke of the fires. A crushing weight of self-loathing settled over Nyra, more painful than any physical wound. "I let him choose me because I wanted to be special," she choked out, her voice breaking in the darkness. "I traded my freedom for a lie." Her greatest fear had finally been realized. Being chosen wasn't a gift. It was a trap. The man who had promised to be her shield had been the very person who brought the sword to her neck. She looked at her hands, which were shaking and covered in the soot of her fallen home. There was no magic in them now, no silver light to heal the dying or break the shadows. She was truly alone, the last of a line that had been systematically betrayed by everyone they tried to save. Because she had rejected Kael to save his throne, and because she had been rejected by the world in return, she felt the mate bond fracture. It was a sharp, searing pain in her chest, like a rib snapping in half. The connection that had been her only anchor was drifting away into the void. The quiet ending of her hope was more devastating than the riot in the streets. She slumped against the cold stone, her eyes closing as she prepared to let the darkness take her for good. What was the point of a lichen heart if it only existed to be broken? But then, through the haze of her despair, a faint, rhythmic thumping echoed through the stone, the sound of the volcano's heartbeat, still steady, still burning. Why was the earth still breathing when she had given up? The realization flickered like a dying ember. She hadn't been chosen by a king or a pack. She had been chosen by the blood itself. Chapter 19. The Ash and the Awakening. The silence of the catacombs was not the peaceful rest of the dead, but the suffocating weight of a tomb built for the living. Because the silver seal on Nyra's brow felt like a physical shackle, every breath she drew tasted of cold iron and stagnant water. She lay on the jagged stone floor, watching the flickering shadow of a spider weaving a web across a crack in the ceiling. Why did the universe continue to spin when her heart had been reduced to a heap of gray cinders? She had given everything to a king who saw her as a piece on a board, and in return, the board had been flipped, leaving her broken in the dirt. A low, rhythmic thrumming began to vibrate through the floorboards of her soul, a sound that bypassed her ears and spoke directly to her marrow. It was the volcano, the ancient heart of Nocturnia, pulsing with a heat that ignored the magical frost Alara had draped over her mind. Nyra pressed her palm against the stone, feeling the tectonic plates grinding far below, a slow and massive power that didn't care about royal lineages or border wars. Because she was stripped of Kael's protection and the court's expectations, she was finally alone with the raw elements of her own existence. Was the wolf truly gone, or was it simply waiting for her to stop looking for it in the eyes of a man? She stood up, her legs shaking like those of a newborn fawn, and caught her reflection in a pool of stagnant rainwater. The girl staring back was gaunt, her eyes hollowed out by betrayal. But the amber flecks in her pupils were no longer flickering. They were glowing with a steady, subterranean fire. She realized then that the seal hadn't been placed on her wolf. It had been placed on her fear. The healers of the Silver Glade weren't hunted because they were weak. They were hunted because they were the only ones who could survive without a master. Why had she spent 19 years begging for a cage when she was born to be the storm? With a sudden, violent snap of her will, Nyra reached for the silver seal in her mind and crushed it with the weight of her own grief. The pain was astronomical, a white-hot spear of agony that tore through her consciousness, but beneath it was a roar that drowned out the world. Her lichen form didn't just emerge, it exploded, the white fur shimmering with a blinding brilliance that turned the dark tunnel into a corridor of light. She wasn't an omega, and she wasn't a queen. She was a force of nature, a primal apex that had finally decided to choose itself. Chapter 20. The Ascension of the Silver Wolf. The transition from the damp darkness of the tunnels to the smoke-choked streets of the capital was a blur of predatory speed and silver light. Because Nyra was no longer suppressed by the doubt of her human heart, her white wolf moved with a grace that made the air itself seem to part in reverence. She leaped from rooftop to rooftop, her claws sinking into the obsidian stone, watching the chaos below with a detached, divine clarity. The High Council's flags were being burned by the very citizens who had cheered for them, the city turning on itself as the vacuum of Kael's absence was filled with terror. Where was the king who had claimed her, and did he even deserve to be found? She reached the summit of the Great Spire, the highest point in Nocturnia, and let out a howl that silenced the fires and stopped the blades in midair. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated sovereignty, a frequency that resonated with the spirit of every wolf in the valley. Below her, the rebel alphas dropped to their knees, not because of a command, but because their inner beasts recognized the return of the true blood. Nyra looked down at her paws, seeing the silver sparks dancing between her claws, a power that could mend a broken bone or shatter a mountain. She was the girl no one chose, yet the very earth was bowing to her presence. A familiar scent of rain and scorched earth drifted up from the plaza, a scent that was now laced with the metallic tang of heavy blood. Kael was there, chained to the central monument, his black fur matted and his body pierced by silver arrows. Valerius stood over him with a sacrificial blade, preparing to end the Draven line before the lunar eclipse reached its peak. Because Kael had fought until his last breath to give her time to escape, he was now a ghost of the king he had been. Nyra felt the fracture in their mate bond pulse with a sudden, agonizing heat, a reminder that despite the lies, their souls were woven from the same thread of destiny. She didn't hesitate, diving from the spire like a falling star, her white form cutting through the smoke like a blade of moonlight. She landed in the center of the plaza, the shockwave of her arrival cracking the pavement and sending the council guards flying. Valerius scrambled back, his face a mask of primal terror as he stared into the molten amber of her eyes. "The Lycan! It's impossible. The seal was absolute," he shrieked, but his voice was drowned out by the low, vibrating growl that erupted from Nyra's chest. She didn't need words to tell him that his time was over. She just needed to breathe. Chapter 21. The Battle for the Soul. The plaza became a theater of divine retribution as Nyra moved through the enemy ranks, her silver aura acting as a shield that turned silver arrows into dust. Because she was fighting for her own right to exist, every strike was infused with a purpose that no political ambition could match. She reached Kael, her muzzle gently brushing against his scarred neck, her healing light flowing into his wounds like liquid gold. She saw his eyes flutter open, the obsidian depths filling with a mixture of shock and a profound, aching relief. He tried to speak, to apologize, but she silenced him with a soft nuzzle, a gesture that said the past was ash, and the future was yet to be written. Kael shifted back into his human form as his wounds knitted together, his hand reaching up to bury itself in the thick, white fur of her neck. "You came back," he rasped, his voice a broken melody of hope and regret. Nyra looked at him, and for the first time she saw him clearly, not as a king, not as a savior, but as a man who was just as lost as she had been. She realized that the betrayal in the war room hadn't been a lack of love, but a surrendering to the same fear that had kept her small. They were both victims of a legacy that demanded they be monsters instead of mates. The rebellion's final stand was a desperate, ugly affair, with Valerius calling for a total slaughter of anyone who didn't swear fealty to the High Council. But the soldiers were no longer listening to the old man. They were watching the White Wolf and the Black King standing together in the center of the storm. Because Nyra had broken the cycle of silence, the magic of the Silver Glade began to spread through the crowd, lifting the heavy veil of aggression that had plagued the packs for generations. She felt the weight of the world shifting, the old system of claiming being replaced by something far more dangerous and beautiful, the freedom to choose. As the moon began to eclipse, casting a deep, blood-red shadow over the volcano, Nyra stood tall beside Kael. She wasn't his queen by law, and she wasn't his mate by force. She was the woman who had walked through the fire and come out with her own crown. She looked at the horizon, sensing the approach of the northern packs, but she didn't feel the old familiar prickle of fear. Why would a goddess fear the barking of dogs? The final push for the heart of the kingdom was about to begin, and this time, the girl no one chose would be the one to lead the way. Chapter 22. The Eclipse of Tyrants. The sky above Nocturnia curdled into a bruised violet as the moon's disk finally slipped into the Earth's shadow. Because the lunar eclipse was the traditional hour of the High Council's darkest rites, Valerius stood atop the sacrificial dais, his face a frantic mask of desperation and waning authority. He raised his silver blade, screaming for his remaining loyalists to slaughter the abomination that Nyra had become. But the air around the plaza had grown thick with a shimmering, iridescent mist that smelled of ozone and ancient forest floors. Nyra, in her towering lichen form, didn't growl. She simply exhaled, and a wave of pure, neutralizing energy rippled through the square. Why did the rebels think their sharpened steel could pierce a ghost made of starlight? Kael rose beside her, his body knitting together with a speed that defied every law of shifter biology. Because the mate bond had moved past claiming into a voluntary resonance, his power was no longer just his own. It was amplified by the silver frequency Nyra radiated. He didn't look at the cowering council. He looked only at the white wolf whose shoulder brushed his own. "They didn't just fear your blood, Nyra," he said, his voice a gravelly symphony of awe. "They feared the day a queen would realize she didn't need a king to be holy." He shifted, his black wolf form expanding until he was a shadow cast by her light, and together they surged toward the dais. The final clash was not a battle of armies, but a dismantling of a lie. Every time a rebel lunged, Nyra's aura pulsed, momentarily severing the connection between the shifter and their inner beast, leaving the attackers confused and human. She moved with a rhythmic, hypnotic lethality, her paws barely touching the blood-slicked stones. Valerius swung his blade in a wide, terrified arc, but Nyra caught the silver metal in her teeth, snapping it like a dry twig. Because he had spent a century suppressing the weak to feel strong, the old alpha collapsed when he realized his status meant nothing to a true lichen. The mouse had finally bitten back, and the venom was truth. As the eclipse reached its totality, a profound silence fell over the city of Nocturnia. The fires died down to glowing embers, and the scent of wood smoke was replaced by the crisp, clean aroma of a world being washed by rain. Nyra shifted back into her human form, standing naked and unashamed amidst the ruins of the High Council's ambition. Kael draped his own tattered royal cloak over her shoulders, his touch no longer a brand of ownership, but a gesture of profound service. "The throne is yours, if you want it," he whispered, his eyes searching hers for a forgiveness he still felt he hadn't earned. Why was the king offering his crown to the girl he had once intended to use as a political shield? Chapter 23: The Rebirth of the Pack. The morning after the eclipse didn't bring a return to the old ways, but a systematic demolition of the alpha hierarchy that had birthed the Ironclaw cruelty. Because Nyra refused to sit on a throne built of bones, she ordered the Great Hall of the Citadel to be stripped of its gold and ivory, turning the seat of power into a house of healing. The border alphas were summoned, not to swear fealty to a man, but to witness the return of the Silver Glades law. "Strength is not the ability to crush," Nyra announced to the assembled lords, her voice ringing with the clarity of a mountain bell. "Strength is the courage to be the first to lower your claws." Kael stood at her right hand, but he sat in a smaller chair, intentionally positioning himself as her protector rather than her master. The transition from Alpha King to consort was a scandal that rocked the territories, yet no one dared to challenge him while the White Wolf walked the corridors. Because the people had seen Nyra heal the very men who tried to kill her, the fear of the lichen curse had transformed into a desperate, hopeful reverence. Little Omegas from across the kingdom began to arrive at the gates, their eyes wide with the realization that they were no longer disposable. Why did it take a genocide and a revolution for the world to remember that every life has a howl? The most difficult meeting came when Cassian was dragged before the new council in chains, his arrogance finally replaced by a hollow, flickering terror. Nyra looked at him, remembering the cellar, the chores, and the words that had once made her want to disappear into the earth. "No one would ever choose me, Cassian. Do you remember saying that?" she asked, her voice devoid of the anger he expected. She leaned forward, the black diamond necklace he had once mocked now glowing with the light of her own soul. "You were right. No one chose me. I had to choose myself." She didn't order his execution. She ordered his exile to the human lands, a fate worse than death for a wolf who valued nothing but rank. That evening, Nyra and Kael walked through the royal gardens, where the first silver-leafed trees of the glade were beginning to sprout from the volcanic ash. The bond between them was no longer a frantic, desperate thing, but a deep, rhythmic hum that synchronized their heartbeats. "I used to think I was the one who saved you in that kitchen," Kael said, stopping to watch the sunset over the valley. "But I was the one drowning in my father's shadow. You're the one who pulled me into the light." He took her hand, his fingers interlacing with hers, and for the first time, Nyra didn't feel the need to look for a hidden motive. Chapter 24. The Legacy of the Chosen. The coronation was not a ceremony of gold and crowns, but a ritual of blood and earth held in the center of the town square. Because Nyra wanted the people to see her as one of them, she wore a simple white tunic and no jewelry, her hair flowing free like a river of moonlight. Thousands of wolves gathered, from the highest alphas to the lowest servants, forming a circle that stretched to the city gates. When the high priestess stepped forward to anoint her, Nyra took the oil and turned to the crowd instead. "I am not your queen because of a title," she shouted, her voice amplified by the lichen magic. "I am your queen because I am the girl you threw away, and I am still standing." Kael knelt before her in the dirt, his head bowed in a public display of submission that shattered the last of the old world's pride. "I choose you," he said, the words a vow that echoed through the silence. "Not as a king, not as a mate, but as a man who knows he is nothing without your light." Nyra reached down and pulled him up, her eyes bright with a joy she had never thought possible. Because they were both whole, their union wasn't a merging of two halves but a collision of two suns. The crowd erupted into a howl that shook the mountains, a sound of liberation that would be remembered for 1,000 years. Months later, the Ironclaw Pack was a memory, replaced by the unified Northern Alliance where rank was earned through service rather than birth. Nyra stood on the balcony of the Citadel, watching a group of young pups, omegas and alphas alike, training together in the courtyard below. She felt a small rhythmic fluttering in her own womb, a new life that would never know the sting of a cellar or the weight of a dormant wolf. Why had she ever believed that love was temporary? She realized now that being chosen was just the beginning. Staying was the true victory. She felt Kael's presence before he reached her, his warmth a familiar anchor in the cooling evening air. He wrapped his arms around her, his chin resting on her shoulder as they watched the first stars appear. "The world is changing, Nyra," he murmured, his voice full of a peace that had been absent for centuries. She leaned back against him, closing her eyes and listening to the heartbeat of the kingdom she had saved. "It had to," she replied, her voice a soft, certain melody, "because the woman who was never supposed to be chosen finally decided to change destiny itself." The girl who was once a ghost had become the sun,